Before we start our episode today, this is just a reminder. History Hack does have a Patreon account and all of your donations are gratefully appreciated. There's lots of perks on there, secret groups on Facebook. Do get involved. We would love to see more of you. Enjoy the episode today. Hello and welcome to another instalment of History Hack. I'm excited, but I'm quite apprehensive because we're doing something that I literally know nothing about. I'm a little bit scared as well because it sounds very complicated and terrifying. But bear with us because we have Amanda Thomas with us, who is an author, historian and linguist with a particular interest in social and medical history. Done a whole bunch of work on cholera. A jolly topic, but so we were actually in the same TV program together because she was in that 2000 Years of London on Channel 5. She's also worked in journalism, public relations. She's worked for the Walt Disney Company and Television New Zealand. She's done a bit of everything, really. But now, Amanda, your interest in non-conformism stems from the discovery that you have an ancestor named Simon, and you found out that he was a Roundhead during the English Civil War and one of the founders of Quakerism in the northwest of England.
Yeah, Simon Osmotherley. Yeah, really interesting group of people, the Quakers, and yeah, hopefully we'll be able to talk about them a little bit later on. But it was because of him that I discovered through some of my family history work that I realised that he's a very distant relative, or at least, you know, back in the mists of time.
Yeah.
And he made me start wondering why. And I think, you know, this is probably the whole genesis for this book, The Non-Conformist Revolution. Why people think about things in the way they do, why they do things the way that they do, why are some people really into education and school and other people just don't care. And but yeah, he was absolutely the inspiration for me with writing this, and it's also really cool to think that I've got a Roundhead ancestor, and then that makes me.
You're lucky Charlie's not on this one because she's ultimate Cavalier, pro-Cavalier cheerleader.
I always thought I would be a royalist because I love the Queen, but then the more I found out about it, the more I thought, no, I think I would have been a Roundhead simply because I really like, you know, knocking the system a bit and thinking, hey, you know, maybe things should change, maybe things should be different. So yeah, it was a really interesting starting point.
Brilliant. Well, so let's just start with, for the layman in the audience, what is a non-conformist?
Well, I mean, in the very broadest of senses, with a small n, a non-conformist is somebody who doesn't conform, somebody who doesn't fit in. Where my book is concerned, non-conformists with a capital N are people who don't adhere to the Orthodox religion. And in this case, people who are dissident Protestants. So in other words, they are Christians, they are Protestants rather than Catholics, but they don't entirely go along with what the Orthodox Protestant religion is saying to them. And they don't feel comfortable with it either.
Okay. So Britain was a Catholic country, wasn't it? Massive upheaval when Henry VIII waded in. He gets the blame, but really there was a wave of Reformation going across Europe at the time. But in our case, it was Henry VIII wanting to get his leg over that sees the Church of England come into being. So talk to us about how much conflict there is. We have this new Protestantism in England, and after sort of we get rid of James II, it is cemented down as the national religion, isn't it? So
I like the way you say, oh, it's all about Henry VIII wanting to get his leg over. I mean, yeah, of course it is.
I mean, yeah,
it is. But it's not. It's actually, I always say to people, it's not really.
Yeah.
It's not all about him wanting to marry Anne Boleyn. It's also about power and control. It's a political thing.
It is, and if there wasn't this huge wave of people underneath wanting to try new ideas and wanting
but there were
established system, then it wouldn't have happened, would it?
No, exactly. I mean, the thing is that I think that, if you don't mind, I think that the turning point, or the catalyst, if you like, isn't so much in the history of Protestant non-conformity and non-conformity with a capital N, isn't so much Henry VIII. It's actually the Black Death, and this is where my interest in disease comes in as well.
Okay.
because after the Black Death, and it's so easy, I think now, or at least it's easier to, with the pandemic that we're going through and with COVID, to understand how people felt in the medieval period when the Black Death, or when plague abated, but following the Black Death, how disillusioned people felt with religion, how they felt let down by God and by the church. And this, I feel, is probably the starting point for people feeling that they were allowed to question their own existence because they felt so let down. But of course, there were lots of social changes going on as well, because so many people had died, with the manorial system breaking down. A large section of the book deals with the Peasants Revolt and revisiting that to see what it was really about. And actually, it was more a political struggle and about rights and about freedom. But all of these things are bubbling under with the Reformation, and particularly the control of the church and the amount of money which was going to the monasteries, the holds that monasteries had over Britain, over England and Wales as a whole. I don't really talk about Scotland in the book because that's another even more complicated story. But in England and Wales, at least, the amount of money that was going to the monasteries and to Rome, to the Catholic Church, in fact, was a lot. And so, you know, these were all issues which were coming to a head. And I feel that, returning to your original thing of Henry VIII, that it was almost an excuse, if you like, for him to change the structure of religion in this country.
I think for me it comes across more as a catalyst as in the actual cause. I liken it to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Yes, it's the catalyst maybe to kickstart the process into war, but without a whole bunch of other stuff happening all across the world, that war doesn't happen.
Exactly. But the thing is that where the Reformation is concerned, all of the pieces of the jigsaw are all there in place. I mean, for example, with Martin Luther, you know, quite a few years before, but people knew what Protestantism was. And one of the interesting things that I talk about in the book is that we're not just talking about sort of, you know, people in the upper echelons of society. There's been an awful lot of work going on, and this is something that really fascinated me in the research of the book, realizing that actually the lower echelons of society, if you want to put it like that, were able to read, not necessarily to write, but most people had a good understanding of reading and could read pamphlets and, you know, information that was handed out. So people already had a good understanding. There were also preachers that went around as well. I mean, one of the things I talk about is with John Wycliffe and the Peasants Revolt is the dissemination of preachers around the country who were also talking to people about what is wrong with the church, what is wrong with Catholicism, or at least with Christianity as it stood in England at the time. So again, when you get to Henry VIII, all of these pieces of the jigsaw are already in place. The problem, though, with the Reformation and with Henry VIII is that, you know, what type of Protestantism do you put in place?
Well, this is the thing, isn't it? Because immediately there's loads of different sects. I mean, the Anabaptists, they're the really crazy ones, aren't they? They're quite scary. So there's all different kinds of Protestants. So actually just saying, yes, we're Protestant now, there was never a consensus on what being a Protestant was, ever.
Not really, not until a little bit later on, probably not until Elizabeth I. I mean, it's difficult to try to sort of generalize with this, but yeah, and so many arguments about, well, you know, should we adopt what Luther said? Henry VIII wasn't particularly keen on that, but although what's very interesting is that he did adopt Luther's stance on, well, if it's not in the scriptures, then, you know, it shouldn't be considered, and he was able to use the supremacy of scriptures to validate his annulling his marriage from Catherine of Aragon. So, you know, it's a bit sort of pick and mix, you know, well, yeah, I like that bit because it suits me, but I don't really like that bit because it doesn't suit me.
Never.
and then, of course, you know, if you end up in the wrong camp, then you're in quite a bit of trouble. And I think that from those early years of the Reformation in this country, because there was also a Reformation going on in Northern Europe, because of all of the discussion that was going on, and because there wasn't this consensus of what was going to be accepted, what wasn't going to be accepted, what wasn't going to be in the Bible, what wasn't going to be in the prayer book, what was going to be in the Bible, what was going to be in the Book of Common Prayer. So many different discussions that you could very easily end up in the wrong camp. And so where all of this is going on, you've then got people who are still in the Protestant camp, but who have been affected by some of these early reformers, like Luther, as I mentioned before, like Calvin, like Zwingli, but then start to look, and also John Wycliffe back in the late 1300s, and thinking, what does this mean to me? And how am I going to deal with my spirituality, my understanding of me in not just in the world, but in eternity, if you like? One of the big arguments in, well, I mean, Catholicism, but particularly in Protestantism, and what we're talking about at the moment, is eternal salvation. And with the fear of death, of, will I go to God? Will I go to heaven? Will I be saved? And a lot of these early Protestants, like Calvin, for example, believed that people, a lot of people, they were already part of the elect. They were already destined for salvation. Now, if you're already destined for salvation, well, you might as well give up in life, mightn't you? Because it doesn't matter what you do, you're going to go to hell. And so, you know, there's questions like this, which were hugely problematic for people who don't have a proper understanding, a modern understanding of science. I mean, it's difficult enough now because, you know, science and religion, spirituality still conflict enormously. But in those days when magic was still considered a real thing, when you didn't have a proper understanding of where, for example, disease came from, or why somebody lives for the length of time that they do. These are really big and problematic questions. And of course, they're questions, if they are concerning your eternal salvation, that people are prepared to fight over and even ultimately to die for. These are really big, important questions.
They are indeed. Let's talk about their non-conformity and the Industrial Revolution. What is the link between these two that you identify in the book?
Well, I mean, it's controversial and it's not controversial, because what's really fascinating is that, and as I did the research for the book as well, which took many, many years, I might say, and you know, sleepless nights, is that so many of the great scientists and industrialists came from non-conformist families. And there's sort of two parts to this, really. On the one part, it's what I was saying a moment ago about an understanding of science. And one of the joys of non-conformity, so in other words, being able to think out of the box basics of Christian doctrine. So in other words, if somebody in the church is saying to you, you are not part of the elect and you are destined for eternal damnation, if you are able to think to yourself, and again, this is what part of non-conformist doctrine, not doctrine, but non-conformity, non-conformist groups, it's a common theme between them, is, well, hold on a minute, you're a priest, you're my local parish priest. How do you know? How are you able to tell me whether I am going to be saved or damned? And it takes a certain type of person to say, well, do you know what? I'm not going to go along with that because I don't believe it. I don't think that what you're saying is right. And if enough people get together and say, well, of course it's rubbish, you know, this vicar, he just decided to become a vicar because, you know, he was the youngest son of the youngest son of some nobleman, and, you know, he's part of the church hierarchy. No, we can have our own conversation with God. We can dictate our own type of spirituality. And when you have a group of people who, and this is really sort of, you know, in the early days post-Reformation and then throughout the Civil War as well, sort of generalizing here a little bit, but if you have groups of people who are able with conviction to say, you know what, I'm not going to go along with what people have already told me, I'm going to think out of the box. If you can think out of the box in that way, and also what I was saying before about literacy being far more widespread than people actually realize, you have a modicum of education, but then that modicum of education enables you to send your children to a grammar school, for example, talking about, you know, perhaps the Elizabethan and post-Elizabethan period. Then suddenly you have, or at least not suddenly at all, but gradually you have an environment where you have a level of education, you have a level of intellectual inquiry in your mind, which is going to lead to further investigation. You're less likely to reject ideas. You're more likely to embrace ideas. You're more likely also to converse with other people who have similar ideas or not, and be able to debate about certain ideas. Now, all of these things together, and also very much where non-conformists are concerned, and particularly say with Quakers and with Unitarians, so this is a little bit further along in the process, looking at post-Civil Wars and in the sort of the crucible time of the Industrial Revolution. These are people who are able to converse with each other, exchange ideas about new concepts, new developments, new inventions, without any concern that these ideas might be held up as being blasphemous or controversial even. There is a spirit of being able to develop your intellect, and that's very, very much the thread that you see through non-conformist families who are very pro-education, also pro-intellectual development, pro-business as well, because another reason why you're going to want to learn to read, apart from the fact you're able to then read the Bible or religious or spiritual pamphlets, is that you can then read to help your business. You can add up basic numbers. All of these things all come together to create this extraordinary environment, which then allows these ideas and inventions, in a very basic of senses, to flourish. And of course, you know, in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, that's exactly what happened. And would you like me to give you an example of how this happened with industrialists?
Yes, do, because I don't, what kind, we're talking about a revolution, but this isn't bloodshed, is it? We're talking about a
No,
cultural
we're
revolution.
talking about a cultural revolution. I mean, bloodshed, you can talk about, what happened during the reign of Mary the First with dissidents and Protestants. I mean, not even dissidents, but being burned at the stake. You can see how, there was some religious persecution during the civil wars. But this revolution is really a cerebral and a spiritual revolution, which leads to something greater. And there's a specific group of people, apart from the Quakers. I write a lot about the Quakers in the book and about how they develop their business interests, how they're connected to the Darbys, for example, at Coalbrookdale. They were Quakers. But the people who I also found particularly interesting was a group of people who were in the West Midlands, in Birmingham specifically, and in that area, called the Lunar Society. And they comprised people like Bolton and Watt, Matthew Bolton and James Watt, and Joseph Priestley, and Josiah Wedgwood, Erasmus Darwin, who's the grandfather of Charles Darwin. And they used to meet regularly and discuss ideas. I mean, they're called the Lunar Society because they used to meet on the night of the full moon at Matthew Bolton's house, and that facilitated their walking home afterwards because there wasn't any street lighting. But their relationship between each other spread to other people as well. And it was very much, in many cases where Matthew Bolton and James Watt were concerned, business relationships, but also they were discussions. There were a lot of letter writing and coming together, comparing ideas, funding each other, funding, for example, Joseph Priestley's experiments on phlogiston, which eventually became, well, it didn't eventually become, but, led to the discovery of oxygen. So this extraordinary coming together of people who were, you could say, were egging each other on to discover more and more and more. And this is something which is so important for early industrial development. And of course, where our own industrial revolution is concerned, without James Watt and the steam engine, well, I mean, Newcomen, I suppose, if you go a little bit further back, but his refinement of the Newcomen engine and his work, and with John Wilkinson also, who helped with the cylinders that were put in the slightly later steam engines. But this the development of the steam engine, without that, the Industrial Revolution just simply wouldn't have taken off in the way that it did. But it was the speed and the intensity with which it was able to happen because of this extraordinary discussion and just excitement that there was between people, and the idea that that it was okay, that let's have a go, and let's invest in some canals because we can, let's build some more canals because it will help our business, and so it goes on.
The link between knowledge and non-conformism is quite mind-blowing for me, having not looked at it this way before. But it's not just men, is it? So non-conformist women, they play a role not only in this education and the proliferation of reading and literacy, but also in the spread of dissent as well.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and it's I kind of think that there's probably a deeper root to this, perhaps with during the Anglo-Saxon period with women in monasteries, but certainly by the medieval period there is very much one of the roles of women in the home is teaching children, and in some cases in families, even their servants, but teaching children to read. And it is women who are doing this in the home. This isn't actually research that I've done. It's been done by other people, but it was bringing that research together and realizing just how important women were in nurturing the family, nurturing children within the family, and encouraging children to read and to be interested in education. And you see this continue. There is a thread, if you like, between these early families and then dissenting families later on, who where women are absolutely key again, but who also within the Quaker religion, because one of the things that Quakers say is that everybody is equal, everybody is the same. Now there's, it's not quite like that. However, there is an equality within the group, which is interesting in that women are also allowed to preach. So once again, you see descendants of these, of early farming families or cloth making families, trading families who are later. It's very difficult trying to put this, sort of encapsulate it in a small frame and without going into an enormous amount of detail, but there is certainly an understanding that women are the educators, women are the holders of this information, and women disseminate this information as well. And it's also really interesting then in the early years of the Industrial Revolution, when you see, I mean, even with the Derbys, for example, in Colebrook Dale, how women are so integral to the running of the businesses in very quiet supporting roles. But, I find this really interesting because I think that we underestimate so much the role of women in history. And say, well, I mean, women, they were just wives. Oh, yeah, they were just tied to the kitchen sink. But actually, this wasn't the case. It wasn't the case at all. Their role was, incredibly important. And the significance of teaching children to read is so enormous because of the gate, the entrance that it gives to other things. If you educate a bright child, my goodness, what they might go on and do. Equally, a bright child might go on and do things anyway, but if you give them that ability to read, it's quite a fascinating prospect. But yeah, I was really, really interested to see how important women were in dissenting families, both, as I say, with the written word, but also with the spoken word as well. And the amount of respect that they held in later years within Quakerism. And there were a lot of women Quaker elders as well in the early days of Quakerism and beyond. It's quite surprising.
You're talking about some quite heady stuff in terms of like, oh my God, women preachers? Surely not. Does this revolution provoke any opposition? Does it anger people?
Oh, yes.
Does the establishment hate them? Is it done in a way that's quite painless to have a different point of view? How do people respond to non-conformists?
Well, it's really interesting because the piece is already in place when you're looking at the Reformation, the difference between Protestants and Catholics. So again, like I said earlier, if you're in the wrong camp, well, you might get burnt at the stake. In the post-Civil War period, where you're looking at the emergence of more distinct non-conformist sects, like Quakers, for example, or Baptists, but where the Quakers are concerned, their disdain for conformity is really abhorred by many people in society. There's also an element of jealousy where this is concerned, because, as I was saying earlier about Quaker children being taught to read, because it's a real business benefit, apart from the fact, well, you can sit quietly and read the Bible or a pamphlet that has got scriptural writings on. Quakers were enormously successful in business and had this extraordinary network as well, because they practiced marriage within their sect only. You weren't allowed to marry outside of Quakerism. So there was a very, very tight-knit group of people who also would meet eventually on a yearly basis in London. So they had contacts outside of their own, say, village group, for example. they knew who people were. And if, for example, I don't know, you're Abraham Darby, a Quaker, and you need somebody who is going to teach you how to do X, Y, Z with your ironworks, well, you probably wouldn't go to a non-Quaker, but you would know somebody through your through the greater Quaker group who could help you. So they were extremely successful group. They also did not believe in the normal hierarchy of society, so they weren't particularly respectful to other people. They wouldn't doff their hats, for example. They used non-polite forms of language when they spoke to you. They believed that everybody was equal in the eyes of God. It's a really interesting concept, but this caused enormous disquiet with people who weren't Quakers. Not only were these people quite rude and disrespectful, but they were also doing really bloody well, making lots of money. How dare they?
Yeah.
In terms, so you have that, you know, feeling, if you like. I've done a lot of work in Quakers. I've been to prayer meetings, and it's a most wonderful, wonderful ideal, if you like. It's really fantastic. It really enraptured me with the whole history of the group, but in the early days they were seen as, I suppose, cliche, but revolutionary dissidents. There was enormous disquiet amongst the powers that be, in other words the government, that these were people who needed to be controlled, who needed to be put down. And in the early days of Quakerism, just in post-Civil Wars, they went through a long period of what they call within the group their sufferings. And a lot's been written about this. There's lists of people who were jailed, who were killed, who were tortured, and just quietly got on with it because they knew that they were right. Their view that, well, you know, we're all God's children. We all have a right to believe and think what we want to. And if that's helping us with our lives and with our business and to continue a livelihood for our children, well, so be it. And there was the sufferings and the persecution that they suffered in these early years of the group. It's quite interesting how it also enabled them to come together even more. It had the opposite effect, in other words, and it strengthened their cause. And eventually legislation meant that they were able to practice quite openly and normally. But in those early years, I mean, it was quite awful for them, and bloody as well. Violent.
You've mentioned Quakers. What other groups are there?
One of the other groups which I found particularly interesting were the Unitarians, who again are a post-Civil War group, and it was much more of a group for intellectuals, if you like. And a lot of the chaps who were in the Lunar Society, like Joseph Priestley, were Unitarians. Again, it was quite a sort of a proto-socialist idea, if you like, if you want to put it in political terms, of, again, like the Quakers, we're all the same in the eyes of God, but Catholics are as well. It's not just a Protestant thing. And they also greatly favoured education and the proliferation of ideas. There's a lot of talking and preaching where this is concerned, which I find interesting in my own background too, because I realise, I mean, my background is Methodist, and Methodism is an extension of all of this, but Methodism was much more for the working classes, but the ability for normal working people to realise that they are the same as other people I keep saying this, in the eyes of God, but this is something which is often repeated in the writings of all of these groups, really. This feeling that it's okay to be who you are, but to also embrace other people as well is powerful. And so that's very much where those, I mean, just naming three, you know, I mean, I could go on and on and on, but I'd probably have to get a textbook out to be able to explain to you what is the difference between all these different people.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think that the key and most important thing is the idea of equality, of freedom, of your rights as an individual. Oh, it's a difficult one, that one. But as everybody on the earth who has been created and will all go to heaven, who are all elect, because everybody will go to heaven unless you're really, really bad. And that's that equality in religion is important.
You've mentioned that your book is, I mean, even to touch Scotland would have blown your word count out of the water, but I'm interested to know, is non-conformism, this revolution, is it a British phenomenon, or are there equivalents in other countries?
No, there are. I mean, the reason I didn't touch on Scotland is because you enter into a whole different discussion about Presbyterianism, which is different to, it's because of all the different things about predestination and equality and, the Trinity. Do we believe it or don't we? What was Jesus really a man, or was he part
Is
of the
the
Trinity?
wine actually the blood of Christ? Or
Exactly, the Eucharist. It's you could. Books have been written just listing all these different things. It was a lot easier to. I mean, Scotland is referenced because particularly the role of Edinburgh University as an educator for non-conformists was enormously important. But what was also important in that regard is the link between non-conformity and Northern Europe. In Edinburgh, for example, you see the link between people teaching at Edinburgh University who have either taught before or have been educated at Leiden University in Holland. And then you also see the influence of, as I said earlier on in the interview, of Luther, of Calvin, of Zwingli. So what's happening in the Low Countries, including Holland, what was happening in Germany, what was happening in Switzerland. I mean, during the Marian period, when Mary I was burning heretics as she saw Protestants at the stake, a lot of supporters of Protestantism escaped to Geneva, to Switzerland, because it was a Calvinist stronghold, and then came back or started corresponding with Elizabeth I. I recommend anybody who's interested in this, go to the British Library to see the exhibition about Mary I and Elizabeth I, because this conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism, and this beginning of the splintering of dissenting Protestant sects, in other words, non-conformist sects, is really well described in the exhibition. I went last week, and it's exhausting because it's so huge, but it explains an awful lot. And of course, please carry a copy of my book under your arm whilst you're going around, because then people will know that you're extremely well informed. But yeah, the connection between what is going on in England, Scotland, and Wales, and to some extent in Ireland, but not so much, and Northern Europe is really, really important. And this is so there obviously is a Reformation going on in Northern Europe as well. But the explosion of scientific and industrial development only really happens in this country. The other area where you see an enormous crossover, and really from even from the reign of Henry I in the medieval period, but particularly from the Elizabethan period, is the exchange of ideas because of industry. Now, I know a lot of people don't like this description, but proto-industrial works in Britain were hotbeds of people, say in the metalworking and the clothworking industry, were hotbeds of people who were coming, in some cases, over from Holland and from Germany to give their expertise, or to take our expertise, but a sharing of expertise on the best way to produce metal and the best way to produce cloth, and also to trade in those things as well. They weren't just, this is something that I talk about quite a lot in the book, they're not just trading on commodities like cloth, like metal, like glass, but they're also trading on ideas. And this really, really close relationship that we had because of trade and with industrial expertise with Northern Europe is also enormously significant from a really early stage.
I have to ask as well, our non-conformism has had an impact on America's history as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't think that will come as a huge surprise to a lot of people, but then it might do. I mean, what's really
dissenters that went there in the first place, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But there was, it was very much considered to be a safe haven for people who didn't fit in all sorts of ways, but particularly for religious reasons. And a lot of people exploited that as well. The last couple of chapters of the book talk about a man called Thomas Payne, who fascinated me quite by surprise. I wasn't intending writing about him when I first started thinking about the book, but I used the town of Lewes in Sussex as a bit of a case study of a place where non-conformity was able to flourish, and non-conformist ideas were influential in all sorts of different ways, but particularly with trade and with shopkeeping. And Thomas Payne spent a lot of his time in Lewes. And one of the things about Lewes was that they had a type of court leet. They were the town itself didn't have a charter, and so they had a self-governing type of town council, you would see it today, of 12 people. It was called the Fellowship of 12, and it worked quite well. It was run mainly not by people who had been elected, but by people who knew, in their words, what was the best way to govern their town. And Thomas Payne he was on the Fellowship of 12, and he was really intrigued by how localism, as we would understand it today, if you want to look at it in modern political terms, how it worked. Because the best people to know about what's best for your town are obviously people who come from your town. But on the other hand, he could also see how dangerous it was that these people were not elected democratically, and the corruption that could arise because of that. So I write a lot about this because I realized that, I mean, Payne also he did a lot of writing about the French Revolution as well, but he went to America and he fought in America as well. He was friends with Benjamin Franklin and with Thomas Jefferson as well. At times I felt that, I don't know, he's quite an enigma, Thomas Payne, and not a massive amount has been written about him. Also because there's not a lot of really solid evidence about his life. There was a lot of covering up about why he did certain things. So it's difficult, very, very difficult to sort fact from fiction. But I got the impression that he wasn't hugely liked. However, what is very interesting is that his ideas, he came from Quaker background and he became a Methodist later. Again, slightly complicated, but he was a non-conformist with a capital N. And the ideals that he discussed and wrote about, and his interest in democracy and how that could enable ordinary people to have a say in their lives and about the governance of their towns is incredibly important. And whether he influenced these people or whether he was just an irritation, whether they knew these things anyway because Benjamin Franklin also, he was friends with all the different people in the Lunar Society. He was, he knew so many different influential people in London. He was sort of, the Kevin Bacon of his time, if you like. But, again, Thomas Paine was an interesting test case to see how these ideas were taken to America and used. And I was looking this morning at the American Constitution, and which was written in 1789. And it starts, "We the people," and goes on to talk about justice, domestic tranquility, liberty, and of course about democracy as well. These are all things which are held dear by non-conformist dissidents. That's not to say that they're not held dear by the Orthodox Church as well, but these are aspects of self-understanding, if you like, self-expression, self-identity, which are incredibly important to dissident Protestant groups like Unitarians, for example. And it's really fascinating to see that these egalitarian views have been used and understood and are part of the understanding of liberty and rights in the United States, and right from the very, very beginning. And it's a really, really fascinating process. And as I say, Thomas Paine sort of caught in all of this, and then went to France thinking that he could from France will have some influence in France. I mean, he almost got himself guillotined, actually. It was just by a quirk of fate that he wasn't guillotined. And I thought, God, this man, he really is quite something. But he really, really thought that because he had been so influential in America, so influential in France, that he would be able to instigate revolution in Britain. And the government were extremely worried about him, but also about other radical agitators as well. But yeah, I mean, the sort of radical change that they wanted were very much along non-conformist lines.
Amanda, this has been amazing. Tell us one more time the name of the book and where people can get it.
Okay, the book is called The Non-Conformist Revolution. Buy my cholera books as well, please.
Yeah, buy all of the books. We'll put links to them all on the History Hack.
Amazing. You can buy them everywhere, and and if you like the book, please give me a review on Amazon as well. I mean, I think it is a controversial book, this one. It's very much a sort of an exploration of ideas and a huge bringing together of all sorts of other ideas from people. Very much a personal exploration for me as well. I do hope I'm going to be able to write another one about it, but we'll see whether that happens or not. So yeah, do buy it and read it. I think that for a lot of people, the non-conformist revolution, their reaction reading it will be, oh, now I see. That will be, I think, the overriding reaction, and I hope so anyway, because that's the effect that I want to give with this, and to give people a starting block to go and explore further, and also to understand how important women are. That's really, really important.
Indeed. Amanda, Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been wonderful.
When our guests join us to talk about their work and their new book, the 45 minutes or so they spend with us is just a taster of all their efforts. So to this end, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest and greatest books. You can support them, and you can support History Hack too. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep at it and bring you more amazing guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/history hack, or just search on bookshop.org for us under the shops bit. Thank you for your continued support, and here's to your next great